On November 19th, 1919, the United States Senate voted to reject the Treaty of Versailles and with it, American membership in the League of Nations. It was one of the most consequential foreign policy decisions of the 20th century. Historians have spent 100 years debating who killed the League. They point to Senator Henry Cabot Lodge. They point to the irreconcilables. They point to Woodrow Wilson's stubbornness. But that night, the celebration was not held in a Senate office or a party headquarters. It was held in the home of a 45-year-old woman who held no office, controlled no budget, and could not even vote. Her name was Alice Roosevelt Longworth, and every powerful man in Washington answered when she called. Chapter 1. The girl her father could not name. On Valentine's Day, 1884, a 25-year-old Theodore Roosevelt lost his wife and his mother in the same house, 11 hours apart. Martha Bullock Roosevelt, Theodore's mother, died of typhoid fever at 3 a.m. on the third floor of the family brownstone at 57 West 57th Street in Manhattan. 11 hours later, on the second floor of the same house, Alice Hathaway Lee Roosevelt died of Bright's disease. She was 22 years old. She had given birth to a daughter 2 days before. Theodore opened his diary that night and drew a large X across the page. Beneath it, he wrote 4 words: "The light has gone out of my life." Then he did something that would define his firstborn daughter for the next 96 years. He left. He handed the infant to his older sister Anna, known as Bamie, and he fled to the Badlands of Dakota Territory. He bought a cattle ranch. He hunted buffalo. He chased horse thieves across frozen rivers. He wrote 2 books. He did everything a man could do to outrun grief. And for 2 years, he almost never mentioned the baby girl he had left behind. He would not call her by her name. The child was called Baby Lee in Bamie's household because Theodore could not bear to hear the name Alice. It was his dead wife's name. Every time someone spoke it, the wound reopened, so the name simply was not spoken. This was not the casual neglect of a distracted father. This was systematic erasure. In Theodore's autobiography, published in 1913, when he was one of the most famous men on earth, he devoted hundreds of pages to his adventures, his presidency, his philosophy. His first wife received 0 mentions, not 1 sentence, not 1 footnote. Alice Hathaway Lee Roosevelt was written out of the official record of Theodore Roosevelt's life as though she had never existed. And the daughter who carried her name understood exactly what that meant. Baby Lee lived with Bamie at 422 Madison Avenue for the first 2.5 years of her life. Bamie was competent, organized, and deeply loving. She gave the child structure and warmth. She also gave her something more dangerous. She gave her the knowledge that she could survive without her father, that she had already survived without her father, that the man the whole country would one day worship had looked at her and walked away. When Theodore remarried in 1886, he returned to claim Alice. His new wife, Edith Kermit Caro, agreed to raise the girl alongside whatever children she and Theodore would have. It was a practical arrangement. Edith was dutiful. She was also, by every account, emotionally cool toward the child who was not hers. Alice grew up in a household of 5 half-siblings who shared 2 parents, while she shared only 1. Theodore loved his children with enormous physical energy. He wrestled with them. He took them on scrambles through Rock Creek Park. He read to them at bedtime. But with Alice, there was always a distance. She reminded him of what he had lost, and she could feel it. Years later, Alice described the family dynamic with the precision of a surgeon. She said her stepmother had been devoted to the letter, but not the spirit, of raising her. She said her father treated her with a kind of guilty generosity that was worse than indifference because it reminded her every day that his love came with conditions. The condition was that she never mention her mother. The condition was that she pretend the wound did not exist. She did not pretend. She simply learned to arm herself with it. The girl who grew up knowing she was too painful to love did not become fragile. She became watchful. She studied rooms. She learned to read the shift in a conversation, the flicker of discomfort in a powerful man's face, the exact moment when flattery turned to manipulation. She learned these things because she had spent her childhood studying the most charismatic man in America, trying to decode why his warmth had limits when it came to her. By the time she was 15, Alice Roosevelt had already mastered the foundational skill of her life's work. She could see what people wanted. She could see what they feared. And she understood, with a clarity that most politicians never achieve, that the gap between those two things was where power lived. Her father had taught her that, not through instruction, but through absence. The most important man in her life had been unable to face her, and from that failure, she built a career of making powerful men face her whether they wanted to or not. But first, she needed a stage. Chapter 2: The Rebel Who Smoked Above the Roof. When 17-year-old Alice Roosevelt arrived at the White House in 1901, she immediately understood something most politicians never grasp. Fame is a weapon. Theodore had become president in September after the assassination of William McKinley. The country was fascinated by the youngest president in history, and the country was even more fascinated by his eldest daughter. Alice was tall, sharp-featured, and radiantly defiant. She carried a green garter snake in her purse, which she named Emily Spinach after her spinster aunt. She smoked cigarettes on the White House roof because her father had forbidden smoking inside. When Theodore confronted her, she reportedly replied that she could either smoke under the roof or on top of it, but she was going to smoke. Theodore later told a visitor, "I can do one of two things. I can be president of the United States, or I can control Alice. I cannot possibly do both." That quote has been repeated for over a century as evidence of Alice's wildness. But it was not wildness, it was strategy. Alice had no inheritance. Theodore's fortune was modest by the standards of Gilded Age wealth, and it would be divided among 6 children. She had no title. American democracy did not grant ranks to presidents' daughters. She had no profession. In 1901, the careers available to women of her class could be counted on one hand, and none of them interested her. What she had was the public's attention, and she understood, at 17, that attention could be converted into influence if you managed it correctly. She began managing it immediately. She attended horse races and placed bets openly, a scandal for a young woman of her era. She drove automobiles at speeds that alarmed the Secret Service. She stayed out at parties until the early morning hours. She accepted gifts from foreign dignitaries that would have caused a diplomatic incident if offered to her father. Each act generated headlines. Each headline increased her visibility. Each increase in visibility made her more valuable to the political ecosystem that surrounded the presidency. The country responded with something close to mania. A popular song, Alice Blue Gown, became one of the best-selling sheet music titles of the decade. The color, Alice Blue, a pale grayish blue that matched a dress she favored, became a national fashion trend. Babies were named after her. Products were branded with her image. By 1903, Alice Roosevelt was the most famous young woman in the United States, and arguably in the Western world. Her father understood that her celebrity had diplomatic value. In 1905, he sent her on a congressional delegation to East Asia. The trip included stops in Japan, China, the Philippines, and Korea. Alice was 21. She met the Emperor of Japan. She met the Empress Dowager Cixi of China. She was treated by foreign governments not as a tourist, but as a representative of American power. She also met Nicholas Longworth on that trip, or rather, she deepened an acquaintance that would become the most strategically important marriage of her generation. The public saw a wild child. The newspapers printed stories of a reckless young woman who broke rules for the fun of it. But Alice was never reckless. Every cigarette on the roof, every snake in the purse, every scandalous headline was a deposit in a bank account she would draw on for the next 75 years. She was building a brand before the word existed. She was manufacturing celebrity as a substitute for the institutional power that her gender denied her. The girl who had been too painful for her father to name had made herself impossible for the entire country to ignore. And now she was about to make the move that would convert fame into something far more durable. She was about to marry into Congress. Chapter 3: The Wedding That Shook 2 Continents. On February 17, 1906, nearly 1,000 guests watched Alice Roosevelt cut her wedding cake with a borrowed military sword, and the Kaiser sent diamonds. The wedding of Alice Roosevelt to Congressman Nicholas Longworth of Ohio was the largest social event the White House had hosted in a generation. 1,000 guests filled the East Room. The Marine Band played. The bride wore a gown of white satin. with a veil of point lace that had been her grandmother's, and she sliced the cake with a sword borrowed from a military aide because no knife in the White House kitchen was long enough for a cake that size. The gifts arrived from across the world and told the story of Alice's diplomatic value in material terms. The French government sent a Gobelin tapestry worth a fortune. Pope Pius X sent an antique mosaic table. Kaiser Wilhelm II sent a diamond bracelet. The Empress Dowager Cixi of China sent bolts of brocade silk and a carved teak chest inlaid with ivory. King Edward VII of England sent a blue and gold enamel snuff box. Cuba sent a string of pearls. In total, Alice received more than 700 gifts from foreign heads of state, ambassadors, senators, industrialists, and society figures. The collection was valued at more than $75,000, the equivalent of more than $2 million today. These were not wedding presents, they were political investments. Every government that sent a gift was investing in a relationship with a woman they understood to be a permanent fixture in American power. And they were right. Nicholas Longworth was a Republican congressman from Cincinnati, 14 years Alice's senior, handsome, cultivated, and a superb violinist who could play Beethoven sonatas from memory. He was also a chronic drinker and a serial philanderer whose affairs were well known in Washington social circles before the wedding took place. Alice knew she married him anyway. The marriage was a strategic calculation, executed with the same clarity she had applied to every other move in her young career. Longworth came from a wealthy Ohio political family. He held a safe congressional seat. He was well liked by the Republican leadership and was already spoken of as a future Speaker of the House. Marriage to Longworth gave Alice something she had never had, an institutional position inside the Republican power structure. As a congressman's wife, she could attend committee hearings without explanation. She could host dinners where legislation was discussed without appearing to intrude. She could build relationships with senators, cabinet secretaries, and party leaders under the social cover of entertaining her husband's colleagues. In an era when women could not vote, could not hold office, and could not lobby openly, a strategic marriage was the closest thing to a political career that a woman could build. The honeymoon told the truth about the union. Alice and Nicholas sailed for Europe, where Alice charmed King Edward at a private dinner, and Nick drank too much at every function. By the time they returned to Washington, the pattern of their marriage was established. In public, they were the golden couple of Republican politics. In private, they occupied separate emotional continents. Alice installed herself in a house near DuPont Circle and began the work that would define the next 7 decades of her life. She hosted dinners, she attended Senate debates, she cultivated relationships with the men who controlled committees, appropriations, and appointments. She listened more than she spoke at first. She filed away secrets, alliances, resentments, and vulnerabilities with the efficiency of an intelligence service. Washington was a company town, and the company was the federal government. Information was the currency that mattered most. Who was feuding with whom? Which senator's vote could be swayed? Which cabinet secretary was about to resign? Alice understood that the woman who controlled the flow of this information controlled something more valuable than any committee chairmanship. She was 22 years old. She could not vote. She could not testify before Congress. She could not write legislation. But she could set a table, pour tea, and arrange a seating chart. And in the Washington of 1906, those skills, properly deployed, were worth more than a Senate seat. The question was no longer whether Alice Roosevelt Longworth would have power. The question was what she would do with it when the stakes were high enough to matter. That moment was 13 years away, and it would involve the death of her father, the future of the world, and a president she despised. Chapter 4. The Woman Who Killed the League of Nations. Alice Roosevelt Longworth could not cast a ballot in 1919, but she could host a dinner party that changed the course of the 20th century. To understand what Alice did in 1919, you first have to understand what she lost in January of that year. Theodore Roosevelt died in his sleep at Sagamore Hill on January 6, 1919. He was 60 years old. His health had been wrecked by a bullet he carried in his chest from a 1912 assassination attempt, and by tropical diseases he contracted during a near-fatal expedition down the River of Doubt in Brazil in 1914. Alice received the news by telephone. She did not collapse. She did not withdraw. She channeled her grief into the project that would become the greatest demonstration of her political power, the destruction of Woodrow Wilson's League of Nations. Her hatred of Wilson was personal and political and total. Wilson had defeated Theodore in the 1912 presidential election, splitting the Republican vote when Theodore ran on the Bull Moose ticket. Wilson had kept America out of the Great War longer than Theodore believed was honorable. Wilson had denied Theodore a commission to lead troops in France, a rejection that Alice believed had broken her father's spirit. And now, Wilson was in Paris, constructing a new world order that would subordinate American sovereignty to an international body, and doing it wrapped in a moral righteousness that Alice found insufferable. She framed her opposition to the League as loyalty to her father's vision. Theodore had believed in American strength, American independence, American willingness to act alone when necessary. The League, in Alice's telling, was the betrayal of everything Theodore had fought for. This was politically shrewd. By tying opposition to the League to the memory of the most popular Republican president since Lincoln, she gave wavering senators a noble reason to vote no. But she did not merely frame the argument, she ran the operation. Her primary instrument was the salon. Beginning in the spring of 1919, Alice hosted a series of strategy dinners at her home for the group of senators known as the Irreconcilables, the 16 Republicans and Democrats who opposed the League in any form. These were not social gatherings. They were planning sessions. Alice arranged the guest lists to ensure that the right senators were in the same room at the same time. She managed the flow of conversation to keep the coalition unified. She served as a back channel between senators who could not be seen coordinating publicly. Her relationship with Senator William Borah of Idaho was the engine of this operation. Borah was the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the intellectual leader of the irreconcilable faction. He was also, by this time, Alice's lover. The affair was one of Washington's worst-kept secrets, tolerated by Nicholas Longworth, who had his own entanglements, and gossiped about in every drawing room in the Capitol. The strategic implications of this arrangement were extraordinary. Alice was simultaneously the wife of a senior Republican congressman and the intimate partner of the chairman of the committee that would decide the League's fate. She had direct, private access to both the House and Senate Republican leadership. No lobbyist could replicate this position. No donor could buy it. No office holder held it. Alice occupied a node in the power structure that existed only because she had built it herself, through marriage, through seduction, and through the ruthless exploitation of a social system that underestimated women. She attended Senate debates on the League nearly every day, sitting in the gallery, taking notes, tracking arguments, and reporting back to the irreconcilables on which fence-sitters seemed to be wavering. She functioned as an informal whip, counting votes the way a floor leader would, except that she did it from a gallery seat and a dining room table rather than a Senate office. She also lobbied directly. She visited senators in their offices. She made phone calls, she wrote letters, she deployed her social connections to arrange meetings between irreconcilable leaders and undecided senators in settings where the conversation could happen without the press watching. In an era before registered lobbyists, before disclosure requirements, before the modern regulatory framework that governs political influence, Alice operated in the open without anyone calling it what it was. Wilson, meanwhile, was destroying his own cause. He refused to negotiate with Lodge on reservations that might have saved the treaty. He embarked on a grueling cross-country speaking tour to rally public support and suffered a massive stroke in Pueblo, Colorado on October 2, 1919. For the remaining 17 months of his presidency, Wilson was largely incapacitated, hidden from public view by his wife Edith and his physician. Alice watched Wilson's collapse with satisfaction she did not bother to disguise. Years later, she admitted that she had stuck pins in a voodoo doll of Wilson. She told the story as a joke. It was not entirely a joke. On November 19, 1919, the Senate voted. The treaty with Lodge's reservations failed, 39 to 55. The treaty without reservations failed, 38 to 53. The League of Nations, Woodrow Wilson's vision for a new world order, was dead in the United States Senate. That night, the celebration was at Alice's house. The senators came, the irreconcilables came, Borah came. They drank and laughed and congratulated each other in the home of a woman who could not vote, who held no office, who had no staff, who controlled no budget, who had operated the entire campaign from a tea table and a dining room and a bedroom and a gallery seat. She was 45 years old. She had just defeated the President of the United States on the most important foreign policy question of the century. And the mechanism she had used, the salon, the strategic relationship, the whispered word, the carefully arranged dinner, was invisible to the historical record because it looked like a woman hosting parties. It was the most consequential act of political influence by a private citizen in American history, and it would take historians most of the next century to recognize it for what it was. But Alice was not finished. She was just getting started, because the same year that killed the League also gave her husband a path to the most powerful position in the House of Representatives. And Alice was about to hold simultaneous access to the Speaker's chair and the Foreign Relations Committee. No one in Washington had ever held that kind of power, and no one would again. Chapter 5. The Tea Table That Terrified the Senate. By 1925, Alice Roosevelt Longworth was sleeping with the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee while married to the Speaker of the House, and everyone in Washington knew it. The 1920s were Alice's decade. Nicholas Longworth was elected Speaker of the House in 1925, placing him second in the line of presidential succession. William Borah continued as Chairman of Foreign Relations, the most powerful committee in the Senate, and Alice, connected to both by bonds that could not be severed or replicated, sat at the center of Republican power, like a spider at the heart of an extraordinary web. Her home at 2009 Massachusetts Avenue became the unofficial clearinghouse of Republican political intelligence. The house itself was unremarkable from the outside, a 3-story brick townhouse in the DuPont Circle neighborhood. Inside, it was the most important political salon in the United States. The mechanics of the salon were precise. Alice served thin bread and butter, small muffins, tea in porcelain cups. The food was deliberately modest because the point was never the food. The point was the conversation, and the conversation was controlled by Alice with a discipline that most committee chairmen would have envied. She decided who was invited. This was the first and most important exercise of power. An invitation to Alice's salon was a signal that you mattered. The absence of an invitation was a signal that you did not. Politicians who fell out of her favor found themselves uninvited, and in the small ecosystem of 1920s, Washington being excluded from Alice's table meant being excluded from the conversations where deals were made. She arranged the seating. This was the second exercise of power. Alice placed senators next to the colleagues she wanted them to influence. She placed cabinet secretaries next to the committee chairmen who controlled their budgets. She introduced rising politicians to established power brokers. Every seating arrangement was a strategic calculation. She was not a hostess. She was an architect of political relationships. She directed the conversation. This was the third exercise of power. Alice would introduce a topic, a pending vote, a committee appointment, a policy dispute, and then guide the discussion with questions and comments that steered participants toward the outcome she wanted. She rarely stated her own position directly. Instead, she created conditions in which the participants arrived at her position themselves, believing it was their own idea. Secretary of the Treasury Andrew Mellon attended regularly. Senate Majority Leader Charles Curtis was a frequent guest. Senators from both parties sought invitations. Foreign ambassadors lobbied for a seat at her table. By the mid-20s, the salon at 2009 Massachusetts Avenue functioned as a shadow government, a place where the real negotiations happened before the official meetings took place. In 1927, Time magazine put Alice on its cover. The accompanying profile described her as the most powerful woman in Washington. It was both an acknowledgement and a containment. By calling her powerful, the magazine recognized what everyone already knew. By calling her a woman, it reassured readers that her power was the feminine, social kind, not the masculine, institutional kind. The distinction was false. Alice's power was institutional in everything but name. On Valentine's Day, 1925, exactly 41 years after her mother's death and her own birth into grief, Alice gave birth to a daughter. She named her Paulina. Washington's gossip circuit immediately began calculating. Nicholas Longworth was 55 and widely understood to be incapable of fathering children. Borah was the obvious candidate. The joke that circulated through drawing rooms and cloakrooms was Aurora Bora Alice, a play on Aurora Borealis. Alice never confirmed or denied Bora's paternity. She let the ambiguity stand because ambiguity was useful. If Paulina was Bora's daughter, then Alice's bond to the chairman of foreign relations was not merely romantic, but biological. It could not be undone. It gave her permanent leverage. Nicholas Longworth's response to the situation was characteristic. He accepted Paulina without comment and continued his own affairs. The Longworth marriage had become a political partnership in which both parties pursued their emotional lives elsewhere, while maintaining the public architecture of a union. In the moral framework of 1920s Washington, this was not unusual. It was simply not discussed. Alice's salon reached its peak of influence during this period. The Harding administration, the Coolidge administration, and the early Hoover administration all operated within an ecosystem that Alice helped shape. She did not set policy directly. She did something more subtle and more durable. She determined which people had access to the rooms where policy was set. She controlled the social infrastructure of Republican power. This was the mechanism that historians have been slowest to recognize. Alice did not exercise power through votes or legislation or executive orders. She exercised power through access. She decided who was in and who was out. She decided which relationships formed and which ones died. She decided which reputations survived and which ones were destroyed. And she did all of this while serving tea in porcelain cups and thin bread on silver trays. The tea table terrified the Senate because the Senate understood what the historians did not. The woman pouring the tea was the most connected political operative in Washington. She had sources in every committee, allies in every faction, and leverage over every ambitious politician who needed her approval to advance. She could make a career with an introduction or break one with a remark. And her remarks, as the next chapter will show, could follow a man to his grave. Chapter 6. The Wit That Could End a Career. Alice Roosevelt. Longworth said Thomas Dewey looked like the bridegroom on a wedding cake, and it followed him through 2 presidential campaigns. In the pre-television era of American politics, public perception of a candidate was shaped not by 30-second advertisements or cable news panels, but by phrases. A single, perfectly aimed sentence could crystallize a politician's image in the public mind and fix it there permanently. No one in 20th century America was better at this than Alice Roosevelt Longworth. Her quips were not spontaneous. They were engineered with the precision of a watchmaker. She tested phrases in private conversation, refined them at dinner parties, and released them into circulation through the network of journalists, columnists, and society reporters who attended her salon. By the time a remark appeared in print, it had already been polished and deployed with intent. Calvin Coolidge, she said, looked like he had been weaned on a pickle. The image was so vivid, so perfectly matched to Coolidge's pinched New England features and sour demeanor, that it became inseparable from his public identity. Coolidge served as president for nearly 6 years. Alice's 7 words outlasted every one of his policies. Wendell Willkie, the Republican nominee in 1940, had sprung from the grassroots of the country clubs of America. The line devastated Willkie's carefully constructed image as a man of the people. Willkie was a Wall Street utilities executive running as a populist outsider. Alice's phrase exposed the contradiction in a single sentence and stripped away the disguise he had spent months constructing. Thomas Dewey received the most famous treatment. "How can you vote for a man who looks like the bridegroom on a wedding cake?" Alice asked. Dewey was the Republican nominee in 1944, and again in 1948. He was stiff, formal, and excessively groomed. Alice's line captured everything the public sensed about him, but could not articulate. It made him ridiculous. And ridicule, in politics, is fatal. You can survive scandal. You can survive defeat. You cannot survive being funny. Her cousin Franklin Roosevelt received the cruelest assessment. Alice called him 1/3 mush and 2/3 Eleanor. The remark accomplished 3 things simultaneously. It diminished Franklin by suggesting he lacked substance. It elevated Eleanor by implying she was the real force in the partnership. And it wounded both Roosevelts by suggesting that the marriage was a vehicle for Eleanor's ambition, rather than Franklin's leadership. Alice's relationship with the Franklin Roosevelt White House was the central drama of her middle years. She and Eleanor had grown up together. They were not friends, Their relationship was defined by a competitiveness that expressed itself in every interaction, from their parallel newspaper columns to their opposing political positions. Eleanor wrote My Day, a daily syndicated column that ran from 1935 to 1962, nearly 27 years. It was earnest, warm, and relentlessly focused on social justice. Alice wrote What Alice Thinks, a column for the McNaught Syndicate that ran for approximately 18 months in the mid-1930s. It was sharp, funny, and deliberately provocative. The contrast was instructive. Eleanor's column succeeded because it looked like service. Alice's column failed, relatively speaking, because it looked like opinion. The public was comfortable with a woman who served. It was less comfortable with a woman who judged. Alice's power worked best when it was invisible, when it operated through whispered remarks and dinner party conversations rather than through bylines and public platforms. Her memoir, Crowded Hours, published in 1933, followed the same pattern. It was entertaining, but carefully controlled. Alice revealed anecdotes and witticisms while concealing the machinery of her influence. The book sold well, but changed nothing about how the public perceived her. She remained, in the popular imagination, a witty society figure rather than a political operative. In 1940, Alice joined the America First Committee, the organization that opposed American entry into the Second World War. Her isolationism was consistent with her opposition to the League of Nations 2 decades earlier. She believed in American sovereignty and American independence from European entanglements. She framed her position, as always, as loyalty to Theodore's vision. Pearl Harbor ended the America First movement overnight. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese attack rendered isolationism untenable. Alice never apologized for her position, but she stopped advocating for it. She understood, as she always understood, when a political position had become unsustainable. By the early 1940s, Alice Roosevelt Longworth was the most quoted woman in America. Her wit was a weapon that every politician feared and every journalist coveted. She had buried one president's legacy with the League fight. She had defined half a dozen others with phrases that outlived their administrations. But the most devastating consequences of her emotional architecture were not playing out in Senate chambers or newspaper columns. They were playing out in the life of a shy, stammering girl who wanted nothing more than her mother's approval and could never earn it. Paulina Longworth was 17 years old, and the damage had already begun. Chapter 7. The Daughter Who Could Not Stop Stuttering. Paulina Longworth's stutter grew worse in only one situation, when her mother was in the room. This is the chapter of the story that Alice Roosevelt Longworth could not control, could not spin, and could not charm her way past. It is the chapter that answers the hardest question about her life. What did the armor cost? Paulina was everything Alice was not. She was quiet. She was shy. She was physically awkward. She was desperate for affection. And she was raised by a woman who had survived her own childhood by eliminating vulnerability from her emotional vocabulary. Alice dressed Paulina in deliberately drab clothes. Visitors to the Longworth home noticed that while Alice was always impeccably styled, her daughter was dressed in muted colors and unflattering cuts. Whether this was intentional cruelty or unconscious competition, the effect was the same. Paulina grew up feeling invisible in the presence of the most visible woman in Washington. Alice demanded that Paulina perform. She expected her daughter to hold her own at the dinner table, to be witty, to be sharp, to entertain the senators and ambassadors and cabinet secretaries who filled their home. For a child with a stutter and crippling social anxiety, these demands were torture. Paulina would freeze. She would stumble over words. The stutter would intensify, and Alice's impatience would radiate across the room like heat from an open furnace. The pattern was a precise inversion of Alice's own childhood wound. Theodore had been unable to look at Alice because she reminded him of what he had lost. Alice was unable to connect with Paulina because Paulina reminded her of what she had never developed, the capacity for tenderness, the emotional armor that had protected Alice from her father's rejection, that had allowed her to operate in the ruthless ecosystem of Washington politics, that had enabled her to face down presidents and senators and the entire American establishment. That same armor made her incapable of giving her daughter what every child needs: warmth, safety, the feeling of being loved without conditions. Nicholas Longworth died on April 9, 1931, of pneumonia in Aiken, South Carolina. He was 61. He died in the home of a woman who was not Alice. Paulina was 6 years old. Alice's response to widowhood was characteristic. She did not grieve publicly. She did not withdraw from society. She maintained her salon, her social calendar, and her political operations without interruption. The message, intended or not, was that Nicholas's death was an inconvenience rather than a loss. For Paulina, who had already lost the only parent who showed her uncomplicated affection, the message was devastating. Paulina grew into a young woman who was fragile, yearning, and increasingly lost. She was sent to boarding school. She struggled academically and socially. She returned to Washington for her debut, which Alice orchestrated with the same efficiency she applied to political dinners and with the same emotional absence. In 1944, at the age of 19, Paulina married Alexander McCormick Sturm, an artist and writer from a wealthy family. The marriage was an escape. Paulina wanted a life that was her own, away from the gravitational pull of her mother's personality. Sturm was creative, sensitive, and troubled. He was also an alcoholic. They had a daughter, Joanna, in 1946. For a brief period, Paulina seemed to have found something that looked like stability. She was a mother. She had a home that was not Alice's home. She had a husband who, whatever his struggles, loved her. Then Sturm's health collapsed. Years of heavy drinking destroyed his liver. He died on November 12, 1951, at the age of 28. Paulina was 26. She had a 5-year-old daughter, and she was alone. What followed was a descent that Alice watched with a detachment that bordered on cruelty. Paulina fell into severe depression. She drank, she took sleeping pills, she withdrew from friends and family, she was hospitalized, she returned home, she deteriorated further. Alice's response was to take control of Joanna. She inserted herself into her granddaughter's life with an authority that Paulina was too weakened to resist. The message, once again, was clear. Paulina was not competent. Paulina could not be trusted. Paulina was failing at the one thing she had tried to build for herself. On January 27, 1957, Paulina Longworth Sturm was found unconscious in her home. An empty bottle of sleeping pills was nearby. Her daughter Joanna, 10 years old, was the one who found her. Paulina was taken to the hospital. She died without regaining consciousness. She was 31 years old. The official cause of death was listed as an accidental overdose. Alice insisted on this classification. Whether it was accurate, whether Paulina intended to die, or simply miscalculated a dose of medication she had grown dependent on, remains unknown. What is known is this: the most powerful woman in Washington had been unable to save her own daughter. The armor that protected Alice from every enemy in American political life had been unable to protect Paulina from anything. Richard Nixon served as a pallbearer at the funeral. He and his wife Pat had been close to Paulina. The Vice President of the United States carried the coffin of a 31-year-old woman who had spent her short life trying to earn the love of a mother who did not know how to give it. Alice took custody of Joanna. She was 72 years old, and for the first time in her life, she was going to try to do something she had never done. She was going to try to raise a child with love. Chapter 8. The Grandmother Who Finally Learned to Love. After Paulina's funeral, where Richard Nixon served as pallbearer, 82-year-old Alice Roosevelt Longworth did something she had never done before. She chose a child over power. The correction on the age: Alice was 72, not 82 when Paulina died. But the transformation was no less remarkable for the earlier start. Joanna was 10 years old, orphaned by both parents before she reached adolescence, carrying the trauma of having found her mother unconscious. She needed everything that Alice had never provided to Paulina: patience, warmth, consistency, the willingness to be present without an audience. And something shifted in Alice, whether it was guilt over Paulina, or the recognition that this was her last chance, or simply the accumulated weight of 7 decades finally cracking the armor. Alice became, by every account, a devoted grandmother. She did not merely house Joanna. She reorganized her life around her. The salon continued. Alice remained a figure in Washington political life. But Joanna came first. Alice attended school events. She helped with homework. She was available in the ways that she had never been available to Paulina. In later years, Joanna would describe her grandmother not with the bitterness that might have been expected, but with genuine affection. Alice, she said, had been the most interesting person she had ever known. The transformation extended to other relationships as well. After Paulina's death, Alice reached out to Eleanor Roosevelt. The two women had been antagonists for decades, their rivalry a fixture of American political life. But grief stripped away the competition. Eleanor had lost Franklin in 1945. She understood loss. She understood the particular agony of family failure. The two elderly cousins found, in the aftermath of their respective sorrows, something that resembled friendship. Eleanor died in 1962. Alice attended the funeral. She said little publicly about Eleanor's death, but those close to her noted that something had changed. The sharpness that had defined Alice's public persona softened not into sentimentality, but into a kind of rueful honesty. She had spent 60 years competing with Eleanor. Now, there was no one left to compete with. Alice's physical decline began in earnest in the mid-1950s. She broke her hip in 1955 and never fully recovered her mobility. In 1956, she underwent a mastectomy for breast cancer. She responded to the surgery with the dark humor that was her signature. When asked about it, she reportedly patted her flat chest and said she was Washington's only topless octogenarian, though the timing of the joke and the surgery suggests she was actually in her early 70s when the first mastectomy occurred. She had a second mastectomy at 83. This time, the line about being topless became one of the most quoted remarks of her later years. The joke served its purpose. It deflected sympathy. It maintained the armor. But it also revealed something about Alice that had always been true. She would rather make you laugh than let you see her pain. Through the 1960s, Alice remained in her house on Massachusetts Avenue, receiving visitors, tracking political developments, and maintaining her position as Washington's most formidable hostess. Her body was failing, her mind was not. She read voraciously. She followed every political development with the attention of a professional analyst. And she continued to issue the devastating one-liners that had been her calling card for half a century. Joanna grew into a young woman who was quiet, thoughtful, and fiercely protective of her grandmother's privacy. She understood, perhaps better than anyone, the cost of Alice's public persona. She had seen what the armor did to Paulina. She had benefited from its partial removal, and she was determined to shield Alice, in her declining years, from the vultures who wanted stories and the historians who wanted access. Alice let her. For a woman who had spent her entire life controlling information, controlling access, controlling the narrative of her own story, allowing Joanna to manage her final years was an act of trust that surpassed anything she had offered a senator, a president, or a lover. The woman who had never been able to love her daughter learned in the last decades of her life to love her granddaughter. It was not redemption. Paulina was still dead. The damage was still done, but it was evidence that the armor, however thick, was not permanent. It could be removed. It just took Alice Roosevelt Longworth 70 years to find someone she was willing to remove it for. Chapter 9. The Last President She Refused to See. Every president from Harry Truman through Gerald Ford made a pilgrimage to Alice Roosevelt Longworth's home on her birthday, because in Washington, her approval still mattered more than a poll. This was the final astonishing act of Alice's career, relevance that outlasted every institution in American politics. Presidents came and went. Parties rose and fell. The entire structure of American government transformed around her. Television replaced the drawing room. Polling replaced the whispered word. Professional consultants replaced political fixers. And still, every February 12th, the most powerful person in Washington drove to Massachusetts Avenue to pay tribute to an elderly woman in a faded house. Her friendship with the Kennedys was a social achievement that demonstrated the full range of her talent. Alice was a lifelong Republican. The Kennedys were the embodiment of Democratic ambition. By every rule of Washington tribal loyalty, they should have been adversaries. But Alice found Jack Kennedy charming and Jackie Kennedy fascinating. She attended Kennedy White House functions. She was photographed laughing with the president. She told him he was the first Democrat worth talking to since her Uncle Franklin, and she meant it as a compliment. She simultaneously maintained her intimate friendship with Richard Nixon. She had known Nixon since his first congressional campaign in 1946. She had supported his vice presidential candidacy in 1952. She had comforted him after his devastating loss to Kennedy in 1960, and his humiliating defeat in the California governor's race in 1962. When Nixon told reporters after the California loss that they would not have him to kick around anymore, most of Washington wrote his political obituary. Alice did not. She continued to invite him to her home. She continued to treat him as a figure of consequence. She encouraged his slow rehabilitation, his careful rebuilding of political relationships, his positioning for another presidential run. When Nixon won the presidency in 1968, Alice was 84 years old. She attended the inauguration. She visited the Nixon White House regularly. The president and the old woman had a bond that confounded Washington observers. Nixon was awkward, suspicious, and uncomfortable in social settings. Alice was the opposite, but they shared something deeper than social ease. They both understood what it felt like to be underestimated, to be dismissed, to be written off, and to come back. Her support for Robert Kennedy's 1968 presidential campaign was the most surprising move of her late career. Robert Kennedy was a Democrat, a liberal, and the brother of the man who had defeated Nixon. Alice's encouragement of his candidacy defied every partisan expectation, but Alice had never been partisan in the conventional sense. She was interested in courage and audacity. She saw both in Bobby Kennedy, and she said so publicly. Robert Kennedy's assassination in June 1968 devastated her. She had now outlived nearly everyone she had ever cared about: her father, her husband, her daughter, her lover, Bora, both Roosevelts, and now the young senator who had reminded her briefly of what political courage looked like. Through the 1970s, Alice's body continued to fail while her mind remained sharp. She followed Watergate with the same intensity she had brought to the League of Nations fight 55 years earlier. She was disappointed in Nixon, but not surprised. She understood power well enough to know that it corroded judgment, and she had seen it happen before. Vietnam War protesters marched past her house on Massachusetts Avenue. Tear gas drifted through her windows. She refused to close them. She told visitors that the tear gas was good for her sinuses. The line was classic Alice, deflecting discomfort with humor, refusing to acknowledge vulnerability, converting pain into performance. In January 1976, Alice made her final visit to the White House. Gerald Ford hosted a bicentennial dinner with Queen Elizabeth II. Alice, 91 years old, attended in a wheelchair. She had met the Queen's great-grandmother, Queen Victoria's daughter-in-law, 70 years earlier during her 1905 diplomatic trip to East Asia. She had met every British monarch since Edward VII. She had outlasted the entire 20th century. When Jimmy Carter won the presidency in November 1976, Alice made her final political move. She refused to receive him. Carter was a Washington outsider, a peanut farmer from Georgia who ran against the establishment. Alice was the establishment. She had been the establishment since 1901. Carter's people reached out, as every president's people had, to arrange the ritual visit. Alice declined. It was not rudeness. It was the last exercise of the only power she had left. The power to deny a president the validation of her company. For 75 years, a visit from a president to Alice's home had meant something. It meant that the president understood Washington. It meant that he respected the invisible networks that held the city together. It meant that he acknowledged the power that never had a title. Carter did not understand these things, and Alice, at 92, did not have the time or the inclination to teach him. She died on February 20th, 1980. She was 96 years old. She had met or known 17 presidents from Benjamin Harrison, her grandfather's friend, through Gerald Ford. She had outlived the horse and carriage, the gaslight, the telegraph, 2 world wars, the atomic bomb, the moon landing, and every political enemy she had ever faced. The question was what she left behind. Chapter 10. The Pillow That Told the Truth. The embroidered pillow on Alice's sofa read, "If you haven't got anything good to say about anyone, come and sit by me." And for 60 years, the most powerful people in America did exactly that. After Alice's death, the artifacts of her life told the story that the obituaries largely missed. The obituaries praised her wit. They celebrated her longevity. They called her a Washington institution. They classified her, one final time, as a socialite. The physical legacy was scattered, but significant. The Longworth House office building on Capitol Hill, named for Nicholas, became one of the three main congressional office buildings, a daily reminder that the Longworth name remained embedded in the infrastructure of American government. The Taft mission photographs from Alice's 1905 diplomatic trip were donated to the Smithsonian Institution, preserving a visual record of American diplomacy in East Asia at the turn of the century. The house at 2009 Massachusetts Avenue, where senators had plotted and presidents had paid homage, eventually became the headquarters of the Washington Legal Foundation. The rooms where Alice had served tea while destroying political careers were converted to conference rooms and offices. The thin bread was replaced by catering trays. The power that had lived in those walls was gone. Joanna Sturm, Alice's granddaughter, became the steward of the family archive. She controlled access to Alice's papers, her correspondence, and her unpublished reminiscences. Joanna was protective, selective, and deeply private. She understood that her grandmother's power had depended on controlling information, and she continued that tradition after Alice's death. The quips survived. They entered the permanent vocabulary of American political commentary. Dewey and the wedding cake, Coolidge and the pickle, the pillow and its invitation. These phrases outlived their targets, outlived their author, and became part of the language that Americans used to talk about power. They are repeated by people who have no idea where they originated, which is perhaps the most Alice Roosevelt Longworth outcome imaginable. Invisible influence embedded so deeply in the culture that it appears to have no source. Historians began reassessing Alice in the decades after her death. The first biographies had treated her as a character, a colorful figure in the pageant of American political life. Later scholars began recognizing her as an operative. They tracked her role in the League fight. They documented her salon's influence on legislation and appointments. They mapped the network she had built and maintained for over half a century. The reassessment is still incomplete. The historical record is biased toward institutional power, votes cast, laws signed, offices held. Alice's power was relational, informal, and deliberately invisible. It left fewer traces in the archive than a single Senate roll call. Reconstructing it requires reading between the lines of other people's memoirs, tracking guest lists and seating charts, and recognizing that the woman pouring the tea was the most important person in the room. The pillow told the truth. Alice had spent her life inviting powerful people to sit beside her and say things they would never say in public. And from those confessions, those indiscretions, those unguarded moments over thin bread and porcelain cups, she had built a power that outlasted every presidency she witnessed. Chapter 11. The Power That Never Had a Name. President Carter's official statement on Alice's death praised her style and grace and sense of humor, and it completely missed the point of her life. Carter's statement was not an insult. It was something worse. It was the final demonstration of the double vision that had defined Alice's entire career. The public saw a socialite, the operators saw a power broker, and the language available to describe a woman's influence in American politics was so impoverished that even a president could not find words for what Alice had actually done. She had operated within a system designed to exclude her. Before 1920, she could not vote. Before the modern era, she could not hold office, run a political action committee, register as a lobbyist, or lead a party organization. Every formal mechanism of political power was closed to her by law or by custom. So, she invented informal mechanisms. The salon was not a social gathering. It was an institution. It had regular participants, an agenda, a decision-making process, and measurable outcomes. Legislation was shaped at her table. Careers were launched or ended. Political coalitions were formed. Committee assignments were influenced. All of this happened under the cover of hospitality, because hospitality was the one form of institutional power that women were permitted to exercise. The disguise was the weapon. By presenting her political operation as a social event, Alice avoided the criticism that would have destroyed a woman who operated openly. A woman who lobbied senators publicly would have been condemned. A woman who hosted senators for dinner was celebrated. The activity was identical. The framing was everything. This is the central paradox of Alice Roosevelt Longworth's life. Her power was real. Her influence was measurable. Her impact on American history was significant. But the system that she operated within required her to pretend that none of this was true. She had to disguise strategy as sociability. She had to present calculation as charm. She had to make the most deliberate political operations in Washington look like a woman simply being a good hostess. The cost of this disguise was not only personal, it was historical. Because Alice's power was invisible by design, it was invisible to the record. Historians studying the defeat of the League of Nations wrote about Lodge and Bora and Wilson. They did not write about the woman who coordinated the opposition from her dining room. Historians studying the Republican Party in the 1920s wrote about Coolidge and Hoover and Mellon. They did not write about the woman who controlled access to all of them. Alice's legacy is not a list of accomplishments. It is a question. How much American political history was shaped by women whose power looked like something else? How many decisions were made at dinner tables and drawing rooms through relationships that the official record never captured? How much of what we call history is actually the visible fraction of a much larger system of influence that operated beneath the surface, unnamed and unacknowledged, because the women who built it were required to make it invisible? Alice Roosevelt Longworth did not answer this question. She embodied it. Chapter 12. The Woman Every President Needed. Alice Roosevelt Longworth was cremated and buried in the grave of her daughter Paulina, a final silent reconciliation with the child she had failed. The ashes of the most powerful woman in Washington came to rest beside the daughter, who had found no peace in her mother's shadow. It was the most intimate act of Alice's life. It was also the most honest. In death, she went to Paulina. She did not go to Theodore. She did not go to Nicholas. She did not go to Bora. She went to the one person she had hurt most, as though proximity in the earth could repair what distance in life had broken. Alice Roosevelt Longworth met 17 presidents. She influenced the defeat of the League of Nations, altering the trajectory of the 20th century. She sustained Richard Nixon's political career through the wilderness years, helping to produce his resurrection and his presidency. She maintained an institution, the Salon at 2009 Massachusetts Avenue, that functioned as an unofficial chamber of government for over 50 years. She defined half a dozen politicians with phrases that outlived their careers and entered the permanent vocabulary of American power. She did all of this without a title, without a budget, without a staff, without an organization. Without, for the first 36 years of her life, even the right to vote. The forms of power she pioneered did not die with her. The strategic dinner party, the carefully cultivated network, the well-placed word that shapes perception before the official debate begins. The relationship that gives access to the rooms where decisions are actually made. These mechanisms still operate in Washington and in every capital in the world. They are still disproportionately wielded by women because women still build relational power when institutional power remains difficult to access, and they are still largely unnamed. Alice understood this. She understood that the most dangerous power is the power that never looks like power. She understood that the woman who controls the guest list controls the conversation. She understood that the woman who controls the conversation controls the outcome. And she understood that the system would never give her credit for it, because giving her credit would mean admitting that the system itself was not what it claimed to be. The girl whose father could not bear to look at her became the woman every president needed to see. The child who was too painful to name became the person whose name opened every door in Washington. The woman who could not vote defeated a president on the most important question of his era. She did not ask for permission. She did not wait for invitation. She walked into the room where the decisions were being made, and she sat down. She poured the tea. She arranged the chairs. She introduced the senator to the cabinet secretary. She whispered the phrase that would define a president. She did this for 75 years, through 2 world wars, through 16 presidencies, through the complete transformation of American democracy, from drawing rooms to television screens to polling data to focus groups. And when it was over, they called her a socialite. Every woman who exercises informal power today, who builds a network instead of waiting for a title, who shapes a conversation instead of waiting for a vote, who understands that access is power and relationships are infrastructure, and a well-timed word is worth more than 100 speeches, is operating in the space that Alice Roosevelt Longworth defined. She built no monuments. She signed no legislation. She held no office. She left behind a pillow, a handful of quips, and an empty house on Massachusetts Avenue. She also left behind a country that is still trying to find the right words for what she was. Not a socialite, not a hostess. Not a president's daughter, not a congressman's wife, not a senator's lover. Something else. Something that the language of American politics still does not have a name for. The most powerful woman in Washington, buried beside the daughter she destroyed. The cost of the armor finally visible. The tea table finally empty. The power at